So this is clock, and the premise of this level is that you can connect one of these inner connection points to the power, and that represents hours, and then I can connect it to one of the outer connection points, and that represents the minutes. You can see the time displayed over on the right, and this will work for any connections that you make. It'll display the approximate time. Obviously, the hour hand doesn't move much depending on the minute hand like a real clock would, but you get the idea. So, to explain the mechanism behind this, basically what I want to do is have it so that only one of each connection point can be connected to power. So, for example, if I connect the one on the right, then this left one is off limits. I cannot access it. Same thing if I power the one on the left. The right one cannot be accessed anymore. Note that the two connections are basically two different wire systems. So the connection point on the right is connected to the door on the left, and the connection point on the left is connected to the door on the right. And there's no cross connection between these two. So to make 12 of them around a clock, we introduce this little bit of a challenge because, for example, the connection point on the left needs to connect to the door on the top and also the door on the right. And the connection point on the right needs to connect to the door on the top and the door on the left. Now, if you trace the connection from the connection point on the left to the door on the top, and then from there down to the connection on the right, we can see that the connection point on the left is basically connected to the connection point on the right, which is also connected to the door on the left. So if I power the connection point on the left, the door on the left also gets powered, which means I die. And this is true for each one of these connection points. So that's a bit of a problem. We need to limit how these doors are closed. So now we've set up gates going into each of the doors, and each of the connection points is connected to the gate instead of the door directly. And so now if I were to power, let's say, the connection on the right, the power would travel to the top door and to the left door directly, but it would also travel down to this bottom connection point, which would then come back into the gate on the right, which normally would power the gate on the right, but the power from the connection point on the right also goes to the gate on the left, which goes through this connection point at the top and then into the gate on the right again. So the gate on the right actually now has two sources of power, whereas all the other gates only have one. So if I go ahead and connect power, you can see that that's the case. This gate now has two power supplies, and so it won't shut. This is true for each of the connection points. Now, this does present a little bit of a problem in that, yes, the correct gates are shut, or yes, the correct doors are shut, but the wrong connection points are still powered. So if I were, let's say this is part of the clock, and I want to take power from this connection point, or from the connection point on the top, and connect it into the segmented display, then I couldn't do that because the segmented display would now be receiving power from basically every one of these connections. So we need to find a way to power the correct doors, not power the door that is receiving, that's like associated with the connection point with the power. And we also need to not power each of the connection points that's not directly receiving power. So one way we can get around this is by adding a gate to each of the connection points, as well as to each of the doors like we did before. So now if I were to power this one on the right, you can see that the gate on the left is now only outputting power to the door itself, and it's not going back to the connection point up top. Similarly, the gate on the top that's connected to the door is only sending an output to the door and not down here to the connection point. So now we kind of have what we want, where the doors are shut for the connection points that we don't want to connect, but the connection points themselves are not powered. But there is a little bit of a better way we can do this. So we can actually get rid of the gates that are connected to the doors, and just have the gates that are connected to the connection points themselves. Now, this normally wouldn't work, but I've actually added this dot in the middle that connects all of the gates together to each other. So the reason that this is required is because, let's say, for example, I give power to the connector on the right. That would go into the gate, which would send power to the door at the top, which would then send power to this gate on the left. And because that is the one and only connection between the gate on the right and the gate on the left, that would technically send power to the connection point on the left, which we don't want, because that would also end up sending power to the door on the right, and that would, kill me as soon as I touched the connection point on the right. But by adding this dot in the middle, now there are actually 2 points of connection between the gate on the right and the gate on the left, which means that if I were to power this connection on the right, the left gate would now be receiving 2 sources of power, and it would not send its power through. So if I do that, you can see that both the gate at the top and the gate on the left are receiving 2 sources of power. And that's just because we have 3 of these little modules with the connector and the door and the gate. We can actually get rid of this dot in the middle if we just simply add another module, right? Because the whole bottleneck there was that we needed 2 connections between any 2 given gates. For example, this gate on the right needed at least 2 connections to the gate on the left, otherwise, it would trigger the connection point on the left. But now that we've got 4 of these modules, there now just by default are 2 different connections between the gate on the right and the gate on the left. For example, we can have the connection from the gate on the right to the door at the top right, and from there it goes directly into this gate on the left. We could also have the connection from the gate on the right to the door at the top left, and then back to this gate on the left. And wiring up everything in this way, where each gate is connected to every door that's in a separate module, this sort of effect is applied to each of these modules. So if I send power to the right, you can see that each of the other gates is receiving 2 power sources, whereas the one that I directly powered is only receiving 1. And so this has the intended result where obviously this door did not shut, and this connection point is the only one that's powered. You can see all the other doors are shut, but none of the other connectors are receiving power. And so in more general terms, all you need is 2 different paths, basically, between these 2 gates. So you can see I've got these 2 dots set up here. And those act as the connections between the gate on the right and the gate on the left. And so this is basically the same setup that we had in the very first example, except now they're not 2 different wire systems. They're both part of the same wire system, but because there are more than one ways to connect these 2 gates, you can see the door shuts, but this is not powered. Again, despite them being part of the same wire system. So the one on the right is not powered now. And so that's sort of the underlying idea behind the entire clock. You know, both the minute, the minute connections and the hour connections, as well as the segmented display. So it's actually, depending on how you do it, it's not really possible to have a 7-segment display because, let's say, for example, the number 1 and the number 2 actually only share one single segment. And so we run into the same problem where the gate of one of the connections is only connected to the gate of the other connection in one way. So that's why the segmented display in the clock level actually has more than 7 segments. And it's to guarantee that each individual gate is connected to each other individual gate in more than just one way. So that we can have sort of this exclusive connection to door setup.